A single choice can forge a sanctuary or invite ruin. Elrond Paradhul stands at the edge of a hidden valley, watching the first elven artisans shape the stone and the river. His decision is made. He will build a refuge here, a place called Imladris, a sanctuary for the free peoples against the growing shadow in the east. It is a desperate act of hope, a place meant for lore and rest in a darkening world. But the risk is immense. Every hammer strike, every song of power, could draw the attention of the Dark Lord Sauron before their defenses are ready. The whispers of dark things stirring already reach this secluded place. By the end of this story, you will witness the incredible birth of Rivendell and understand the immense cost of creating a beacon in the darkness. Can a sanctuary be built when every act of creation might be its destruction? And wherever you are in the world right now, listening as day turns to evening, or perhaps as the moon rises, I would be curious to know what your own corner of the world looks like in this moment. What does it truly take to build a place of peace when the world is falling into shadow? The hall in Lindon fell silent as Elrond unrolled his maps. He spoke not of walls and armies, but of memory and medicine. His finger traced the deep cut of the valley, the course of the Loudwater River, a natural moat that could be fortified with ancient song. This would be a house of healing, he argued, a library for lost lore, a sanctuary where the free peoples could find strength. It was a vision of defense through preservation, a shield made of wisdom, but the faces looking back were etched with doubt. Whispers slithered through the assembly. To build so boldly was to light a beacon in the encroaching night. It would lure the eye of Mordor, one lord declared, scattering their strength when they needed to hold fast to their great cities. Only a few saw the desperate hope in Elrond's plan. The elf lord Glorfindel, whose own light had once banished darkness, stood and pledged his sword, yet his was a rare voice of support. The council's refusal was a cold, political reality. They would not grant him warriors from Lindon's armies. They would not spare craftsmen from the forges of Eregion. Imladris would be born orphaned, cut off from the powers it was meant to aid. Elrond's choice in that moment defined his entire endeavor. He would not abandon the vision. He would build it with a handful who believed, staking his own lineage and honor on this hidden refuge. The stakes were now terrifyingly personal. Without the council's support, the sanctuary was vulnerable from its first day. As the dissenting lords filed out, their silken robes whispering against the stone, Elrond turned to the small band remaining. They were so few. The grand dream now rested on their shoulders alone, and the wild, watchful dark beyond the mountains seemed to press in a little closer. The first nights in the valley were a symphony of vigilance, not rest. Elrond and Glorfindel stood back to back with their small cotter of scouts, their elven eyes piercing the deceptive shadows of the mountain pass. They were not just builders, they were wardens. The wildness here was ancient and hostile, a raw chaos of jagged stone and whispering spirits that resented this new order. And through that wildness, Sauron's spies had already found them. Skirmishes with marauding orc bands became a brutal routine. The clash of steel against crude iron echoed through the canyons, a stark counterpoint to the gentle sounds of the river. But the greater battle was unseen. Glorfindel, a beacon of ancient light, stood against the malevolent spirits of the mountains, his very presence a song of power that forced the shadows to recoil. Each victory was costly, paid for in fatigue and vigilance, but with every patrol, they pushed the darkness back a little further. The immediate land was slowly, painfully cleansed. The local wildlife, once fearful, began to watch them with curious eyes, and the lesser Maiar spirits, the hidden guardians of the land, offered their tentative trust. This was not a conquest, but a courtship of the valley itself. The pivotal moment came not on the battlefield, but at the river's edge. Elrond knew that stone and sword alone would not hold back the coming storm. He knelt beside the loud water, placing his hands upon the cold, wet stone of the bank, drawing upon the unique power of his half-elven heritage, a lineage that bridged the mortal and the immortal. He did not command the land. He communed with it. He spoke to the memory in the stone and the song in the water, weaving their ancient strength into the very purpose of the refuge. It was an act of profound binding, a giving of himself to the land that left him drained and pale, but which stirred the earth with a new, subtle power. The river itself seemed to flow with a clearer purpose, and the cliffs felt more alert, as if watching. Every skirmish, every exhausted ritual, proved the fears of Linden's council were terrifyingly valid. Sauron's attention was indeed turning their way. They were not merely building a sanctuary, they were racing against an approaching army, fighting for the right to exist before that army arrived. With the immediate borders secured through blood and song, the heart of the valley could finally be shaped. The true work of creation was about to begin. The stone was not merely placed, it was awakened. At the precise confluence of the rivers, where the waters of the loud water met and mingled, Elrond knelt. In his hands he held a single, seamless slab of pale granite, and into its heart he poured a song of binding and protection. This was no simple ceremony. It was an act of profound sacrifice, a channeling of his own vital essence into the unyielding earth. As the song left his lips, a tremor passed through the very soil of the valley. The air itself seemed to thicken with a new, watchful presence, and then the lights came. High in the boughs of the ancient Malorn trees, soft elven lights flickered into being, not as temporary flames, but as permanent, gentle stars caught in the leaves. The waters of the Bruinen began to hum with a low, resonant frequency, a latent power that promised to rise in fury against any evil that dared to cross its path. The spiritual heart of Rivendell now beat with a steady, undeniable rhythm, but the cost was etched on Elrond's face. As the last note of the song faded, he swayed, his strength utterly spent. His companions rushed to his side, their faces etched with a new fear. The fledgling refuge, still so vulnerable, was now without its strongest protector. He had chosen to bear this cost personally, a demonstration that his commitment was not just one of command, but of profound, personal sacrifice. This act proved the sanctuary's incredible potential, transforming it from a hidden camp into a true place of power. Yet that very power was a double-edged sword. The spiritual resonance they had created was a brilliant beacon in the world of the unseen, a signature that could not be hidden. They had just issued a direct, if silent, challenge to the darkness in the east, ensuring that Sauron's gaze would now turn toward the mountains with a more focused and malevolent interest. As Elrond slowly began to recover, The valley echoed with the hopeful sounds of hammers and the clear songs of elven labor, but a pressing new question now occupied the minds of his followers. They had built a vessel of power, a beautiful and potent shell, but how would they fill it? A refuge needed more than just strong walls and enchanted rivers to stand against the coming shadow. It needed a soul. It needed the accumulated wisdom, the forgotten lore, and the very artifacts of light that the darkness sought to extinguish forever. The sound of the river's hum was broken by the frantic drumming of hooves. A single rider, his cloak gray with the dust of hard leagues, thundered into the heart of the valley. He bore the sigil of the elven smiths of Eregion, and his face was a mask of grim urgency. The sealed message he pressed into Elrond's hand was not a mere scroll of greeting. It was a plea, a desperate call from Celebrimbor himself. The shadow in the south was coalescing, no longer a distant rumor, but a gathering storm. The smiths, creators of the great rings of power, feared for the safety of their masterworks and their very lives. They asked for Elrond's counsel, and more, they asked if Imladris could serve as a hidden vault, a sanctuary for their most precious creations. In that moment, the isolated dream of the refuge shattered. Elrond's gaze swept from the rider's weary face to the half-built arches of his own hall. His internal conflict was a silent, sharp pain. To agree was to tie the fate of his vulnerable sanctuary directly to the greatest target of Sauron's wrath. It was to invite the Eye of Mordor to look directly upon his hidden valley. Yet to refuse was to abandon his kin, to break an ancient alliance, and to potentially allow the artifacts of elven power to be lost or, worse, captured. The safety of his own people demanded he shut the gates. His duty to all the free peoples demanded he open them. His decision was a measured, costly gamble. He would not yet commit the full strength of Imladris, for it had little to spare. Instead, he summoned his most trusted scouts and lore masters. He ordered them to ride for Eregion with all speed, to offer what aid they could, and to see with their own eyes the true scale of the threat. It was a decision that honored the old alliances, but it left his own realm feeling painfully exposed. As that small company rode out, the valley suddenly seemed much quieter, and its defenses felt thinner. The stakes of their endeavor were irrevocably transformed. This was no longer just about preserving a place of rest. Rivendell was now being pulled into the central conflict of the age, positioning itself as a potential final stronghold for all elven knowledge should the unthinkable happen and Eregion fall. Elrond watched the dust from their departure settle, the weight of the wider world heavy on his shoulders. That pressure did not remain an abstract feeling for long. It soon took physical form in a small, weary group of travelers who appeared at the head of the pass, seeking shelter from the growing dark. They came not as a proud host, but as a broken, straggling line of shadows against the evening light. Elrond's scouts led them in, a handful of elves from the southern lands, their fine clothes torn, and their eyes hollow with a terror that words could not capture. They were the first tangible proof of the shadow's advance, living echoes of the doom that had befallen Eregion. The valley, until then a place of quiet, purposeful labor, was suddenly filled with the raw sound of grief and the desperate need for shelter. Without a moment's hesitation, Elrond's small community moved. The builders laid down their tools and took up rolls of cloth for bandages. The cooks stretched their meager stores of lembas and foraged roots to make thin, sustaining broths. The healers, their hands still stained with river clay from the morning's work, began their gentle, arduous task of mending not just wounds of the body, but the deeper scars left by fear. Elrond himself moved among the newcomers, his calm presence a quiet anchor in their storm of loss. He decreed that no one would be turned away. Imladris would be a sanctuary in truth, or it would be nothing at all. This single decision, made in the face of overwhelming scarcity, defined the very soul of the refuge. Yet this sudden swell of population strained their fragile existence to its limit. The carefully rationed food supplies dwindled alarmingly. The simple shelters, built for a dedicated few, were now overcrowded, the air thick with the shared breath of exhaustion and sorrow. A subtle tension grew between the original builders, weary from their long labors, and the new arrivals, who were often too traumatized to offer immediate help. Whispers of doubt slithered through the community. Could they afford such compassion? Had their leaders' mercy doomed them all to a slow starvation? And worse, a more sinister fear took root. Could the enemy's agents have hidden among these pitiful souls, using their suffering as a disguise to infiltrate the one safe place left? Every new face was now a potential threat. Every whispered conversation, a possible betrayal. The stakes of their endeavor had irrevocably escalated. This was no longer a theoretical defense of a place, but the active, continuous guardianship of lives. The weight of each life saved now rested squarely on Elrond's shoulders. In response, the construction of the Great Hall took on a desperate new urgency. It could no longer be just a place for counsel and song. It had to become a bulwark against the despair these refugees carried, a physical space large enough to house both their bodies and their shattered hopes. The valley's night air was no longer filled with songs of lament, but with the rhythmic, percussive music of the forge. Under Glorfindel's direct command, the elven smiths of Imladris worked alongside a small, trusted band of dwarf friends who had arrived with the refugees. Together, they did not craft mere tools. They forged starlit blades, quenching the newly shaped steel, not in simple water, but in the enchanted dew collected from the malorn leaves at dawn. Each finished sword seemed to hold a fragment of the night sky within its edge, gleaming with a soft, cold light in the presence of shadow. Simultaneously, other artisans worked on the valley's gateways, weaving silver and mithril into the living rock to create arches that shimmered with a barely perceptible energy, portals that could be made impassable by a whispered word of power. This was the refuge arming itself, and the constant, reassuring glow from the forges became a tangible symbol of hope, visibly strengthening the community's spirit. Yet this progress was born from fierce debate and painful scarcity. The smiths desperately needed certain rare metals, ores that were now nearly impossible to acquire with the mountain passes watched by enemy eyes. A deeper conflict divided the council. Some, particularly the dwarf friends and many of the warriors, argued for high, imposing walls and towering watchtowers, a declaration of strength that would deter any attacker. They saw the subtle work of the lore masters as a frivolous distraction. Others, led by Elrond, saw such overt fortifications as a fatal arrogance. A great wall, he argued, was a challenge and a fixed target. It could be besieged, broken, and scaled. His decision was final and defining. The greatest defenses of Imladris would not be of stone and mortar, but of mist and water. He decreed they would perfect the manipulation of the River Awakens and weave illusions of shifting fog through the high passes, creating a labyrinth that would confound any invading force. It was a choice that emphasized ancient wisdom over brute force, a gamble on the power of the land itself. This philosophical victory, however, came with its own escalating price. Every hammer strike on a new sword, every glint of a star-lit blade in a guard's hand, was a clear signal. The hidden refuge was no longer just hiding. It was preparing for war. This visible readiness made it a far more valuable and tempting prize for the enemy. Sauron would not tolerate a fortified bastion of elven power rising in his rear, a place where the free peoples could gather their strength. The very act of forging their defenses increased the likelihood that those defenses would one day be tested to their absolute limit. They were racing to become unassailable before the Dark Lord decided they were too dangerous to ignore. As the new weapons were distributed and the sentries took up their posts with renewed confidence, a different, quieter kind of forging began in the groves and libraries. For Elrond and his lore masters knew that in the struggle to come, the strength of a remembered song or a fragment of forgotten history could be as vital as the sharpest steel. The chief lore master's hands trembled not from fatigue, but from revelation. Spread across his table of polished beechwood were maps and scrolls salvaged from the refugees, a jigsaw of ruin and memory. He had been tasked with preserving knowledge, but he had uncovered a danger. The fragments spoke not just of fallen cities, but of a single, nameless artifact, a relic of the First Age thought, lost to time, hidden somewhere in the uncharted depths of the misty mountains. The same mountains that now sheltered them, and from the patterns in the texts, it was clear the enemy's servants were also searching. The lore master's heart was torn in two. His every instinct as a scholar screamed to recover this power, to secure it within their vaults and deny it to the shadow. Yet the practical voice of a survivor whispered a terrible truth. To mount an expedition would be to send their best warriors and scouts on a quest that could take months, leaving the valley desperately vulnerable. It would be a gamble, with their very existence as the stake. He brought his grim discovery to Elrond in the quiet of the evening. The debate that followed was hushed and heavy. Some argued that inaction was the greater risk, that to leave such a weapon for Sauron to find was an unforgivable failure. But Elrond's gaze was fixed on the fragile community outside his window, on the healers tending the wounded and the smiths forging their last reserves of metal into swords. He saw the exhaustion in their eyes, the thin line they walked between hope and despair. His decision was a painful exercise in triage. "We cannot chase phantoms," he said, his voice quiet but final. "To risk the certain safety of the people we shelter for the uncertain chance of a hidden object would be a betrayal of our purpose. Our duty is to the lives in our care, not to the potential of power." The lore master bowed his head, the scholar in him chastened but understanding. The choice was made. They would not seek the artifact. Yet this decision to let the threat lie dormant did not bring peace. It merely transformed the nature of the danger. A latent, unseen pressure now settled over Elrond's leadership. He had accepted a sleeping dragon in their backyard, gambling that the mountains would keep their secret. To counter this, he knew their passive defenses were no longer enough. They needed to become invisible, not just impregnable. This new imperative turned his mind inward, toward the valley's own ancient heart. He turned from the council and walked away from the half-built halls, his path leading him toward the oldest part of the refuge, a place where the air grew still, and the very light seemed to remember a time before the sun and moon. He sought the sacred White Grove. The air within the White Grove was thin with memory. Elrond passed between the ancient trees, their pale bark seeming to drink the twilight, and knelt upon a carpet of silver moss. This was the sanctuary's oldest heart, a place where the veil between the world of form and the world of spirit was worn to a whisper. He did not come to build or to command. He came to listen. His song began softly, a thread of sound woven from the quiet of the stars and the deep hum of the earth. It was a call, an invitation to the latent spirits of the land, the ancient Maya like guardians who had slumbered in the stone since the world was young. For 3 days and nights, he did not move, his spirit journeying far from his body, seeking pacts of protection with these unseen wardens. Slowly, the grove began to answer. A profound, watchful presence settled over Imladris, a feeling of being observed by something ancient and benevolent. The very leaves seemed to turn, following movements in the unseen world. Yet this act of profound communion was a beacon in the spirit realm, and it drew a hungry gaze. A shadow detached itself from the deeper dark, a spectral entity of pure malice that fed on light. It saw the nascent power of the grove not as a shield, but as a feast. The battle was joined without a single sword being drawn. It was a duel of essence. Elrond's song of binding and light met the entity's silent, corrosive will. The entity sought to twist the grove's purity, to taint the roots with despair, and for a terrifying moment, the white bark began to gray and wither. Elrond faced a terrible choice. To destroy the entity with a blast of raw power would shatter the delicate spirits he had just awakened, scorching the grove's soul. Instead, he chose a path of far greater difficulty and risk. He shifted his song, weaving a complex, resonant net of containment. He did not seek to annihilate the shadow, but to imprison it, channeling all its corrosive malice into a single, leafless tree at the grove's edge. As the final note of the song faded, the desiccated tree stood as a grim monument, its bark now black and cold, a prison cell of living wood. The grove was safe, its watchfulness restored, but Elrond's victory was double-edged. He had proven his mastery over the unseen world, yet he had introduced a permanent vulnerability into the very heart of their refuge. They now guarded a captive enemy within their walls, a sleeping poison that required eternal vigilance. The effort of the binding left him spiritually hollowed, his strength spent. As he walked back toward the main house, his steps heavy, the first flakes of an unseasonable snow began to fall. The wind carried a new, biting cold, a physical echo of the spiritual battle he had just fought. This was no gentle winter. It was a harsh, early assault that threatened to freeze the valley's last edible shoots and seal the mountain passes, cutting them off from any hope of resupply. The spiritual siege had been contained, but a siege of ice and starvation was just beginning. The snow fell with a purpose that felt anything but natural. It was a deep, enduring cold that iced over the Bruinen's protective hum and sealed the mountain passes with walls of impassable white. This was no simple turn of the seasons. It was a siege, a magical winter crafted in the forges of Mordor to starve them out. Inside the valley, the frantic work on the Great Hall slowed, then stopped, as all energy was diverted to a single, desperate purpose. Survival. The elves, creatures of starlight and enduring life, now huddled for warmth, their breath pluming in the frigid air of their own, nearly finished refuge. Morale, once kindled by the glow of the forges, plummeted as the gnawing reality of hunger set in. Their grand sanctuary was on the verge of becoming a beautiful, frozen tomb. Elrond faced the cruelest calculation of his leadership: to hoard the emergency seed grain and preserved whey bread in the deep cellars was to ensure they could plant again in a future that might never come. To use it was to sacrifice their next spring for a chance at one more week of life. He looked upon the pale, hungry faces of the refugees, at the children who had already lost so much, and his decision was immediate. He ordered the deepest cellars opened. It was a gamble that placed the beating heart of their community above its long-term prospects, a choice to live now, even if it meant an empty future. The elves turned their power inward, their songs no longer for shaping stone, but for coaxing stubborn warmth from the frozen soil, creating small, magically heated plots to nurse the last hardy greens. Yet it was not enough. The primal stakes of simple survival now overshadowed all their grand designs. As the community shared meager rations and body heat in the half-built hall, a small, grim party prepared to venture out. A sylvan elf named Elrond, whose people knew the harsh whims of the wild better than most, stepped forward. He would lead a handful of hunters into the blizzard-ridden passes, a final, desperate gambit to find what game might still be moving in the unnatural white. It was a mission that risked everything for the slimmest chance of bringing back life for all. The wind screamed across the ice, a razor's edge of cold that sought to flay the warmth from their very bones. Eregion, a sylvan elf whose name meant noble wanderer, led the small hunting party through a world of blinding white, her senses stretched to their limits. They were tracking a phantom, a great stag whose prince appeared and vanished in the shifting drifts, a creature that seemed more a trick of the light and their desperate hunger than a beast of flesh and blood. For 3 days, it led them on a ghostly chase, drawing them deeper into the jagged teeth of the mountains, away from the fading safety of the valley. The journey was a relentless war against the elements. Whiteout blizzards swallowed the world, reducing their reality to the few feet of howling wind in front of them. They tested every snow-covered ledge with their lives, their elven grace the only thing saving them from plunging through treacherous sheets of ice into hidden crevices. And always there was the feeling of eyes upon them, a prickling on the back of the neck that had nothing to do with the stag. It was a malevolent watchfulness that clung to the shadows of the rocks, a presence that felt old and deeply hungry. On the 4th day, as the storm briefly broke, they cornered the stag in a high basin. It was real, magnificent, and terrible, its breath pluming in the frigid air. The act of bringing it down was swift, a single, clean shot that felt less like a victory and more like a sacred, sorrowful transaction. The meat they butchered from the massive creature was more than just food. It was life itself, a tangible hope they could carry back to their starving people. It was as they began their grueling return, their packs heavy with the precious burden, that Eregion saw it, a narrow defile, almost completely obscured by a recent avalanche, and a curtain of ancient, snow-laden pines. It was a pass, a secret corridor through the mountains that did not exist on any of Elrond's meticulously drawn maps. Her blood ran colder than the ice clinging to her cloak. This was a back door, an unguarded entrance leading straight into the heart of their hidden refuge. Eregion stood frozen, a terrible choice crystallizing in her mind. To investigate the pass properly would take hours they did not have, and every moment's delay risked the lives of those waiting for the food. Yet to ignore this gaping hole in their defenses felt like a profound betrayal. Her decision was a testament to her people's pragmatism. The immediate need of the community outweighed the potential threat. She would get the life-saving meat home. But with a hunter's cunning, she did not simply turn away. She memorized the precise alignment of the peaks above the defile, the shape of a lightning-blasted pine that stood sentinel nearby, and she tucked a single rune-carved stone from her pouch into a fissure in the rock, a marker only her keen eyes would ever find. The journey back was a forced march fueled by dread, the triumph of their hunt now shadowed by the chilling knowledge they carried. The sight of the half-finished hall, wreathed in smoke and desperate hope, was a profound relief. As the meat was distributed, and a fragile joy spread through the community, Eregion did not join the quiet celebrations. She went directly to Elrond, finding him in his study, his face already grim with the weight of endless winter. She told him of their success, and then, her voice low and steady, she told him of the pass. The temporary surge of hope in the valley was instantly tempered, replaced by a cold, strategic fear. Their sanctuary, the one place meant to be a bastion against the dark, had an unlocked door, and they had no way of knowing if something had already crept inside. The faint, melodic chatter of sparrows outside the great hall suddenly curdled. Glorfindel, standing watch on a high balcony, froze. His senses, honed in the undying lands, parsed the birdsong not as simple animal speech, but as a twisted cipher, a series of coded clicks and pauses woven into the natural rhythm. The message was short, furtive, and it was not meant for elven ears. It spoke of patrol schedules, of weakened river mists, and of a hidden pass. The spy was not at their gates. The spy was among them, breaking bread and sharing warmth, while whispering their secrets to the wind. A cold deeper than the lingering winter settled in Glorfindel's heart. He did not raise an alarm. He went straight to Elrond. The news, delivered in the hushed confines of Elrond's study, was a poison seeping into the refuge's foundations. It was one thing to face an army at your walls, another to fear the hand that offers you a cup of water. Whispers began, not of birds now, but of elves. A sidelong glance during a shared meal carried new weight. A private conversation that fell silent upon approach became a subject of suspicion. The very camaraderie that had sustained them through the snows now felt fragile, a thin sheet of ice over a lake of doubt. Elrond saw the fear in their eyes, the subtle way the community began to fracture. A public accusation would be a wildfire, burning every bond of trust to ash. His decision was one of immense restraint. He gathered Glorfindel and his most trusted captains, and he forbade any open inquisition. Instead, he would hunt in silence. That night, alone in his chamber, Elrond looked upon the ring Vilya, the great blue stone set upon his finger. It was not a weapon of war, but an instrument of preservation and understanding. He did not wield it like a hammer. He let its power radiate outwards, a gentle, imperceptible wave of perception washing through the halls and groves of Imladris. It was not a search for guilt, but for a dissonance, a single note of corruption in the sanctuary's quiet song. He sought the one heart that beat in rhythm with the shadow in the east. The spy, a quiet scribe who had arrived with the first refugees, felt the change in the air. It was not a sound or a sight, but a pressure, a feeling of being gently, inexorably seen. The magical scrutiny was a net closing without a single rope being visible. Panic, cold and sharp, replaced their calculated patience. They realized their time was measured in hours, not days. If they were to be discovered, they would not go quietly. Their mission had always been to break this place, and if they could not do it from within its society, they would do it by striking at its soul. Their eyes turned toward the newly completed library, its arches still smelling of fresh cut wood and vellum. Within its walls lay the collective memory of the elven exiles, the very reason Imladris had been founded. To burn it would be to murder memory itself. As Elrond's silent search continued, the spy moved through the moonlit corridors, a shadow headed for the heart of all their knowledge. The first scent was not of smoke, but of ozone and spoiled honey. Caranthir, the quiet scribe, did not strike a flint. He whispered a word of unraveling, and a cold, green-tinged flame bloomed from his palm, clinging to a shelf of first-age genealogies. This was no ordinary fire. It drank the moisture from the air and hissed defiance at the first panic-driven splash of water, its enchanted tendrils slithering hungrily toward scrolls of ancient song and star charts. Knowledge itself was now screaming in the silent, consuming light. The ensuing chaos was a weapon in itself. Scholars became firefighters, their precious manuscripts used as bludgeons to beat at the unnatural flames. Warriors, drawn by the shouts, found themselves in a desperate, unfamiliar battle, trying to salvage history from a sentient inferno. And through this carefully orchestrated bedlam, Caranthir moved like a ghost, slipping past distracted sentries and making for the high pass, his escape path now clear. In his study, Elrond felt the violation like a physical blow, a spike of corrosive magic piercing the sanctuary's serene song. The ring Vilya flared on his finger, its power a tidal surge waiting for his command. He could feel Caranthir's fleeing presence, a stain of malice receding into the night. He could reach out with that power, snare the traitor in bonds of air, or shatter his mind from a distance. But his gaze was locked on the library, on the shimmering heat haze of dark enchantment that threatened to erase millennia of memory. The choice was agonizing and instantaneous. Vilya's power would not be a weapon for capture, but a shield for preservation. He stretched his will toward the river Bruinen, not to summon a raging flood, but to call forth its essence. A thick, cool mist, heavy with the river's innate resistance to evil, rose from the waters and flowed through the library's arches. It did not try to drown the magical flames. It smothered them, starved them of the malevolent energy that fed them, until the last green ember died with a defeated sigh. The lore was saved, the library's stone bones blackened but intact. But in the time it took to make that choice, Caranthir had vanished into the jagged landscape, his trail growing colder with every second. The pursuit was immediate, a company of the swiftest hunters led by Glorfindel himself, their faces set in grim lines. They were not just chasing a single traitor and a more. The tracks at the mouth of the hidden pass told a terrifying new story. Caranthir had met his contact. The boot prints of orcs, fresh and numerous, mingled with his elven footprints, all pointing inward toward the unprotected heart of the valley. The spy's escape was not a flight to safety. It was the opening move of an invasion, and he was now the guide leading a war band through the refuge's open back door. Hooves tore at the thin soil, striking sparks against the hidden stones of the foothills. Glorfindel leaned low over Asfaloth's neck, the wind of their passage a frantic roar in his ears. Ahead, a dwindling speck of darkness that was Caranthir wove through the jagged terrain, his path a desperate, straight line toward the sanctuary's fatal flaw. Behind Glorfindel, his company of riders strained to keep pace, their elven steeds flowing over the ground like a swift, silver tide, but the land itself conspired against them. Narrow, rock-strewn valleys forced them into single file, their speed checked at every turn by the threat of an ambush from the high cliffs. Each precious second Caranthir gained was a stitch pulled from the fabric of their defense. Glorfindel's mind, clear and cold as a mountain stream, calculated the grim geometry of the chase. He saw the shrinking distance, the spy's unwavering trajectory, and the looming shadow of the pass he sought. They were losing. They would not catch him as a group. The choice was a spark in his heart, immediate and absolute. He would not lead his warriors into a trap. He would become the trap himself. A single, sharp command sent Asfaloth surging forward, a bolt of white lightning leaving the silver tide behind. This was no longer a pursuit. It was a duel, a race between one hero and one traitor for the soul of a refuge. The stakes could not be higher. If Caranthir's voice, shouting the secrets of their home, reached the ears of the waiting orcs, the hidden warband would pour into the valley like a poison into a vein. The first major assault would begin not at their gates, but within their very heart, and the dream of Imladris would drown in blood and fire before its great hall was even finished. Glorfindel's solitary charge was a blur of golden light and white mane, closing the final gap with a terrifying, silent speed. He reached the mouth of the pass just as Caranthir skidded to a halt, his face a mask of shock and fury. The traitor stood at the threshold, his hand raised to signal the darkness behind him. But Glorfindel was there, a living barrier of light, his sword gleaming in the thin mountain air. For a single, suspended moment, the two elves faced each other, the fate of the valley balanced on the edge of a blade. Then the shadows within the pass itself began to shift and writhe. The orcs were not waiting deep within the canyon. They were already here, massed just out of sight, their crude iron blades now glinting as they stepped forward into the fading light. The enemy was not coming. The enemy had arrived. The narrow pass echoed with the shriek of steel meeting steel. Caranthir's blade was a sliver of darkness, humming with a corrosive magic that sought to devour the very light around it. Against this, Glorfindel moved with the terrifying grace of a force of nature. His own sword was not merely a weapon, but an extension of the ancient light of Valinor that still lived within him, a radiance that made the shadows of the pass recoil. The duel was not a lengthy contest of skill, but a violent, decisive eruption of opposing wills. Glorfindel's first parry sent sparks of pure white light cascading against the stone walls. His second strike, a fluid, unstoppable motion, twisted the corrupted blade from Caranthir's grip, sending it clattering into the dust. He forced the traitor to the ground, a knee on his back, the point of his sword, a silent threat at his throat. But victory was already slipping away. With his last breath before capture, Caranthir threw back his head and let out a piercing, ululating cry, a sound that was less a shout and more a weaponized shard of noise. It ripped through the canyon, bouncing off the walls and flying deep into the darkness of the pass. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then, from the deep shadows, came an answering chorus of guttural shouts and the chilling scrape of iron on rock. The alarm had been raised. Glorfindel's decision was instantaneous, a warrior's calculus in the face of a collapsing plan. He could not hold this narrow entrance alone against the tide that was now stirring. He hauled Caranthir to his feet, binding his hands with a swift, brutal efficiency, and began a fighting retreat, dragging his prisoner backward. The first orc scouts emerged from the gloom, their yellow eyes gleaming with malice. Glorfindel met them at the threshold, his sword a whirlwind of light, holding the line for the precious seconds his company needed to arrive. Each parry, each swift and fatal strike, was a message bought with time. The hidden pass was no longer a secret. The war for Imladris had begun not with a siege of its grand gates, but here, at a forgotten crack in its armor. The sounds of that first brutal skirmish, the clash of metal and the harsh war cries, did not fade into the mountains. They were carried on the evening wind, over the newly built arches, and through the groves of healing trees, a discordant melody that reached the ears of Elrond as he stood on a high balcony. He did not need a messenger. The music of violence on the wind told him everything. The time for building was over. The distant clash of steel was a bell tolling for the refuge. Elrond did not hesitate. His voice, calm yet carrying the weight of command, cut through the evening air, and the sanctuary erupted into a controlled frenzy of preparation. Every elf who could hold a blade or a bow was moving, not in panic, but with a grim purpose drilled into them through long months of vigilance. They flowed to their pre-assigned positions along the valley's rocky rim, their gray cloaks making them ghosts against the stone. Others reinforced the main ford, where the river was most easily crossed, digging trenches and setting sharpened stakes. Meanwhile, the lore masters who moments before had been saving scrolls now joined their voices in a low, resonant chant, weaving layers of unseen power into the mist that clung to the Bruinen, turning its gentle rush into a latent, deadly barrier. In moments, the character of Imladris was utterly transformed. The gentle haven for healing and lore became an armed camp. The forges, which had glowed with the creation of starlit blades, now roared with the urgent work of repair, the rhythmic hammering a frantic heartbeat for the community. Non-combatants, the healers, the children, and the still weary refugees were shepherded into the deepest, most secure halls, their faces pale but resolute. The air, once filled with the scent of blooming Elanir and the sound of quiet song, was now thick with the smell of hot metal and the tense, whispered commands of captains. The primary point of assault remained a terrifying unknown. Would the enemy pour from the hidden pass or smash against their main gates? Elrond, standing at his command post with a map of the valley laid out before him, made his critical gamble. He would not commit his main force to reinforce Glorfindel at the flank. To do so would be to play into the enemy's hands, scattering his strength across the vast terrain. Instead, he trusted his champion to harry and delay, to funnel the attackers toward the primary, expected approaches where the full might of their prepared defenses awaited. It was a decision that placed immense faith in one elf, and one that risked being overrun from an unexpected quarter. The survival of Imladris, this fragile dream made manifest in stone and song, now hinged on this single strategic choice. Its first true test of arms would decide everything, determining whether this beacon of light would be extinguished in its infancy or stand as a bastion for ages to come. As the final defensive lines were set and the last magical wards shimmered into place, a tense, unnatural silence fell over the valley. It was a silence filled with the rustle of leaves and the relentless rush of the river, a quiet so profound it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. And then, from the direction of the high pass, that silence was shattered by the thunder of approaching feet and the rising, guttural roar of an orc war chant. A tide of black iron and snarling flesh broke from the tree line. The orc host was a vast, churning chaos of bodies, their numbers seeming to stain the far bank of the Bruinen. The air, once crisp with the scent of pine and clean water, grew thick with the reek of unwashed hides, old blood, and something deeper, a foulness of spirit that made the stomach turn. They crashed their spears against crude shields, a dissonant drumbeat of hatred meant to shatter elven nerves before a single arrow flew. Across the river, the defenders stood in silent, ordered ranks, their starlit blades and silver bows a stark contrast to the seething mass. Yet even the most seasoned warrior felt a cold knot of dread tighten in their chest at the sheer, overwhelming scale of the enemy. This was no skirmish. It was an annihilation in waiting. Elrond stood motionless at the center of his line, his gaze fixed on the horde. He could feel the tension in his warriors, the primal urge to strike, to break that terrifying display with action. A younger commander might have ordered a volley of arrows to punish their arrogance, or even a charge across the ford to seize the initiative, but Elrond saw the deeper game. The river was their most powerful ally, a natural barrier that could bleed the enemy white before they ever reached elven steel. His command rippled down the line, calm and absolute. Hold, let them come, let them test the water. It was a decision that required immense faith in the land itself, a patience that felt like agony as the orcs' taunts and jeers washed over them. The stakes in that moment shifted from the strategic to the deeply personal. This was no longer about defending a refuge or ideal. It was about the life of the elf standing next to you, the healer in the hall behind you, the very ground beneath your feet. The reality of death was now a physical presence, as tangible as the bowstring taut in your hand. The Orc Chieftain, a massive brute clad in scarred plate, understood the challenge in the elves' stillness. With a guttural roar, he swept a cleaver toward the river. The first wave of orcs, driven by bloodlust and the fear of their master behind them, surged down the bank and plunged into the Bruinen's current. The water, which moments before had seemed so calm and inviting, suddenly felt different. A low hum, felt more than heard, vibrated up from the riverbed as the first boot touched the sacred stream. The river did not simply rise, it awoke. As the first orcs splashed into its shallows, Elrond and the circle of mages raised their voices in a single, resonating chord of command. It was not a plea, but a summons to a power that had slumbered in the water for ages. The Bruinen answered, its placid surface convulsed, the water gathering itself into colossal, white-maned waves that took the shape of stampeding steeds, their riders crests of furious foam. The river was no longer water. It was a cavalry of pure, elemental wrath. The front ranks of the orc host were not merely pushed back. They were erased, swept away in a churning, roaring chaos of water and shattered iron, their guttural war cries drowned in the river's triumphant roar. The sound was immense, a physical pressure that shook the very stones of the valley. Holding that fury was an act of supreme will. Elrond stood at the center of the storm, his face a mask of concentration, his spirit the anchor point for the raging torrent. He was not just controlling the water, he was the water, feeling every orc life extinguished in its cold grasp, a terrible, necessary burden. And then, as suddenly as it began, the fury ceased. Elrond lowered his staff, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The river subsided, flowing swift and high, but no longer supernatural. He had broken the first and fiercest wave, but he knew this was only the beginning. To continue the magical assault would drain him and the mages completely, leaving them defenseless for the next, inevitable blow. He had to conserve their strength, a calculated gamble that the river's natural flow would now be barrier enough. The far bank was a scene of utter devastation, littered with debris and stunned survivors. For a moment, a fragile hope bloomed in the hearts of the elven defenders. They had witnessed their lord's power made manifest, yet that very display was a strategic revelation. They had just shown their strongest card, the one defense the enemy had not fully anticipated. Across the river, the massive Uruk commander bellowed, his voice cutting through the disarray. He was not retreating, he was adapting. A second wave began to form, this one even larger than the first. And moving among them were twisted, cowled figures, their hands weaving patterns of dark energy that seemed to still the very air around them. A dull, oppressive silence fell where their spells took hold, a void that drank the river's resonant hum. The water ahead of them grew strangely calm, its protective magic muted. The enemy had not been defeated. They had simply learned, and they were now sending their answer across the river. A dark, creeping silence smothered the river's roar where the shaman's spells took hold. The Bruinen's waters, moments ago a raging protector, went slack and dull, their inherent spirit muffled by this web of shadow. Across this unnaturally placid stretch, the second wave of orcs charged, their crude rafts and pounding feet meeting no resistance. They scrambled up the near bank, their numbers a seemingly endless flood of snarling faces and rusted blades, and crashed into the waiting elven shield wall. The sound was a sickening crunch of metal and wood, a brutal counterpoint to the earlier symphony of elemental power. This was no longer a battle of magic, but a primal, close-quarters slaughter. Elven skill and fluid grace met orcish brute force and overwhelming numbers in a desperate, grinding struggle. The line of defenders bent inward under the weight, a silver curve straining against a tide of black iron, but it did not break. Each elf fought with the knowledge that the ground they stood on was the threshold of their home, that one step back would bring the war into their sacred groves and half-built houses. Elrond watched, his own power reserved, as he saw the fatigue begin to tell on his frontline warriors. Their precise parries grew a fraction slower, their elegant footwork becoming labored on the blood-slicked grass. He could not afford to lose the ford. His decision was swift and surgical, a single, sharp command, and his reserve force, a company of fierce sylvan elves who knew every inch of this wild land, erupted from concealment. They did not simply reinforce the line, they became a spearhead, a focused, furious countercharge that drove into the densest part of the orc formation. Their long spears, wielded with woodland ferocity, punched a hole through the enemy's center, splitting their momentum and giving the main line a precious moment to rally. The integrity of their primary defense was holding, but at a terrible, exhausting cost. Just as this new equilibrium was forged in blood and steel, a new sound cut through the din of battle. It was not the guttural roar of orcs, but the sharp, coordinated blast of war horns echoing from the northern valley rim. The sound came from behind their main position. The threat from the hidden pass had not been contained. It had arrived, and it was now striking at the Refuge's utterly vulnerable rear. Screams from the upper valley tore through the din of the ford. The orcs were not just at their gates. They were inside, their guttural cries echoing from the very courtyards meant for peace and healing. The cunning captain from the pass had used the main assault as a perfect distraction, leading his best climbers up the treacherous northern cliffs to spill into the Refuge's undefended heart. Panic was a contagion, spreading faster than any flame among the non-combatants huddled in the halls. The sanctuary was being violated, its most vulnerable people now staring into the snarling faces of the enemy. Elrond's gaze swept from the straining shield wall at the river to the plumes of black smoke beginning to rise from the residential groves. His command was a gut-wrenching necessity. He placed the defense of the ford in the hands of his most trusted captains, then turned with his personal guard. They did not walk, they ran, a silver and gray spearhead, racing away from the primary battle to confront the cancer growing within their home. It was a terrible gamble, thinning the main line to save its soul. The conflict had instantly fractured into a desperate, two-front war, stretching the defenders so thin that every sword felt the weight of the entire refuge. Elrond's arrival in the inner court was not a subtle thing. It was a shockwave of focused power, where a moment before there had been chaos, with a handful of healers and scribes desperately holding a doorway with little more than courage. Now there was order. His guard flowed into the fray, their blades a whirlwind of cold, precise fury, cutting down the orcs who had believed their victory was assured. The immediate tide of the inner skirmish turned, but Elrond's eyes were already searching the chaos, parsing its logic. He found it in the figure of the orc captain. This was no mindless brute. While his warriors scattered to loot and burn, the captain was a blade of singular purpose, shoving his own soldiers aside to press forward. He was not heading for the Great Hall or the crowded healing wards. His path, ruthless and direct, led toward the oldest, most silent part of the refuge, a place guarded not by soldiers, but by ancient song. He was making a determined push for the White Grove. The air within the grove's perimeter was thick with the scent of crushed silver moss and the metallic tang of orc blood. Elrond and his guard met the enemy captain's charge at the very threshold of the white trees, their blades a sudden, violent storm against the encroaching dark. The orc captain was a mountain of scarred flesh and black iron, and his sole purpose was clear in his burning eyes, a desire not just to kill, but to defile. He sought the leafless, blackened tree at the grove's heart, the prison of the shadow entity. With every step he took toward it, the ground seemed to sicken, and the pale bark of the surrounding trees began to gray. This was no longer a simple battle for territory. It was a fight for the Refuge's soul, for the very spiritual foundation that gave Imladris its power and its peace. If this sacred heart was corrupted, the hope that sustained every elf within the valley would wither and die. Elrond moved to intercept the massive captain, his own sword meeting the brute's cleaver with a shower of brilliant sparks. Around them, his personal guard fought a desperate, swirling melee against the captain's elite warriors, their silver blades a desperate barrier against the tide of defilement. The conflict was as much spiritual as physical. Elrond could feel the malevolent presence within the bound tree stirring, its prison walls straining as the orc captain's innate dark magic resonated with its captive fury. A sharp crack, like the breaking of a great bone, split the air. A fissure appeared in the black bark of the imprisoned tree, and a wave of despair washed out from it, so potent it made the elven guards falter for a heartbeat. In that moment, Elrond faced a terrible choice. He could press his attack, risking a killing blow on the captain, or he could address the imminent, catastrophic rupture. His decision was one of profound sacrifice. He disengaged from the duel, turning his back on the orc captain, and raised the ring Vilya. He did not channel its power as a weapon. Instead, he poured its energy into the cracking tree, a torrent of pure, preservative light aimed at reforging the spiritual bonds that held the entity captive. It was an act of ultimate defense, but it left him utterly exposed. The orc captain, sensing his opportunity, roared in triumph and brought his massive cleaver down in a brutal arc. The blow caught Elrond across the shoulder and back, the sound a sickening crunch of metal on bone. He cried out, his concentration broken, and fell to one knee, the light from Vilya flickering. Seeing their lord fall, his guard fought with a feral, desperate strength. Their blades became a whirlwind of vengeance, cutting through the remaining elite warriors until they surrounded the orc captain. He fell under a dozen piercing strikes, his roar of victory dying in a gurgle of blood. The immediate threat to the grove was ended, but the victory was hollow. Elrond stumbled, his hand pressed to a wound that seeped not just blood, but a faint, shadowy mist. He was gravely hurt, and as he struggled for breath, a new sound reached them from the distance, carried on the wind from the main ford. The desperate clash of battle had taken a sudden, terrible turn, the elven war cries now tinged with the sharp edge of panic. The rising sun struck Glorfindel's helm like a crown of fire as he crested the ridge. Below, the ford was a churning nightmare of straining elven shields and a seemingly endless tide of orc flesh. But he saw the weakness, the exposed flank, the moment of supreme pressure. He did not shout a command. He simply lowered his starlit blade, and Asfaloth leaped forward as if born from the dawn itself. The charge of his riders was not a maneuver of war. It was a force of nature, a thunderous wave of silver and wrath that broke upon the orc host's side. The impact was catastrophic for the enemy. Orcs who had been moments from overwhelming the main line were now caught in a grinder of hooves and elven steel, their formations dissolving into panicked, isolated mobs. The sight of that golden warrior, gleaming with the light of a forgotten world, shattered their will as thoroughly as the charge shattered their ranks. The weary defenders at the ford felt the shift like a fresh wind. Their fatigue burned away in a surge of renewed hope. With a collective cry that was part song, part battle frenzy, they pushed forward, their shields becoming an advancing wall that crushed the disorganized enemy against the riverbank. Glorfindel himself was a spear point aimed at the heart of their command. His eyes, older than the sun now climbing the sky, locked onto the massive Orc Chieftain, who still bellowed orders, trying to rally his crumbling forces. Ignoring the lesser blades that scratched at his armor, Glorfindel drove Asfaloth straight through the chaos, a path of light cutting through the shadow. The duel was brutal and short. The chieftain swung his massive, serrated blade, a blow meant to cleave both horse and rider. Glorfindel did not parry. He flowed inside the arc of the swing, his own sword a single, precise flash. The chieftain's roar was cut short, his head separating from his shoulders as the golden blade passed through flesh and bone without resistance. With their leader slain and their lines in tatters, the last vestige of fight left the orc host. What had been a battle became a slaughter, and then a rout. The remaining creatures broke, scrambling back toward the river in a mindless, terrified flight, the elves pressing their advantage with relentless, grim efficiency. Yet as the defenders surged forward, driving the broken enemy into the waiting currents of the Bruinen, a single figure did not run. A cowled shaman, forgotten in the chaos, stood his ground on a small, rocky island mid-river. He was not trying to escape. His hands were raised, not in surrender, but in a final, desperate invocation, his voice a guttural rasp that fought against the river's song. A sphere of malevolent, wavering energy began to coalesce between his hands, aimed not at the warriors, but at the river itself, a last, spiteful act to poison the very heart of the sanctuary. The cowled shaman stood alone, a final knot of defiance in the unraveling chaos of the rout. As his kin fled, he planted his staff in the river's shallows and raised his hands to the sky, his voice a guttural shriek that clawed at the air. He was not aiming for flesh and blood. A spear of pure black energy, cold and silent, shot from his fingertips. It did not arc toward the elven warriors. It flew straight and true, bypassing every physical defense, and struck the pale granite foundation, stone at the heart of the main house. The impact was not a sound, but a sickening tremor that ran through the soil and up into the bones of every living thing in the valley. The elegant arches of the half-built hall groaned as if in mortal pain, and the very light seemed to dim as the sanctuary's spiritual core shuddered under the assault. This was not an attack to break walls, but to unravel the song of protection itself, to poison the refuge from its very source. Elrond, bleeding and leaning heavily on his guard, felt the violation like a spike driven into his own spirit. He saw the black energy crawling like rot across the heartstone, seeking to sever the bonds he had so painstakingly woven. To block such a spell directly would have required a force that might shatter the stone itself. His choice was one of ultimate sacrifice. Shoving himself upright, he ignored the fiery agony in his shoulder and raised the ring Vilya. He did not meet the darkness with a wall of light. Instead, he opened himself to it, using the ring as a conduit. He drew the corrosive spell into his own being, a torrent of spiritual poison that seared through his veins. His body became the crucible, and with a final, soul-wrenching effort of will, he transmuted that hatred, grounding its vile essence deep into the indifferent earth beneath his feet. The black energy dissipated with a defeated hiss, leaving the foundation stone scarred with a web of gray, bleached of its pure white luminescence. Across the river, the shaman crumpled, his life extinguished with his last malice. A profound and heavy silence fell, broken only by the soft cries of the wounded and the relentless, healing whisper of the river. The battle was over, but the cost was etched into the scarred stone and into Elrond's ashen face. The Refuge had survived its first true test, but its innocence was gone, replaced by the grim knowledge of what it would take to endure in a world at war. The morning light felt thin and heavy over the scarred ford. Elrond moved not as a lord, but as a healer, his own wound a dull, throbbing echo of the greater pain around him. He knelt in the damp grass, his hands gentle as he pressed Athela's leaves into steaming water, the clean, heartening fragrance, a small defiance against the stench of blood and iron. Each elf he tended to was a story of courage, their eyes holding the lingering shadows of the night's terror. While he worked, Glorfindel moved through the field with a different purpose, his golden armor now dulled with grime. He directed the grim, necessary labor of gathering the fallen, his voice low and steady as he counted the cost. Each name spoken was a weight added to the silence that had replaced the clamor of battle. The Refuge was secure, its borders held, but the price was etched into the ashen faces of the living and the still forms of the dead. A shared, profound grief settled over the community, a cold fog that muted the relief of victory. The land itself bore the wounds, the grass churned to mud, and the sacred white grove, now shadowed by the memory of violation. The conflict was no longer against an external enemy, but an internal struggle to process the trauma, to find a way to breathe through the weight of their loss. Elrond looked from a fallen young scout to the weary, grieving faces around him, and his decision was made. He would not let these deaths be merely a cost of war. He decreed that a new grove would be planted, a grove of remembrance deep within the valley's heart. Every defender who had fallen would be honored there, their names not carved in stone, but sung into the very memory of the valley, so the wind through the leaves would forever whisper their courage. This choice was the first step in healing, a deliberate act to weave their sacrifice into the enduring identity of Imladris, solidifying it as a place that understood the deep bonds between loss and hope. The stakes of their endeavor had irrevocably shifted. The test was no longer one of strength in arms, but of strength in spirit. How they honored their dead, how they carried their grief, would define the soul of this refuge for all the ages to come. As the silver pyres of the honored dead burned bright under the emerging stars, their light a fleeting bridge between earth and heaven, Elrond turned his gaze from the past to the uncertain future. He knew this hard-won victory was not an end. It was a profound and difficult beginning. The hidden haven had proven it could survive an assault. Now, it must learn how to live and to become a true beacon in the long darkness. The first messenger from Imladris did not ride to Lindon with a plea, but with a quiet statement of fact. He carried no scroll detailing their needs, only a simple recounting of the battle at the ford and the names of the honored dead. This was not an appeal for help. It was an announcement of existence, a declaration that the sanctuary had endured its trial by fire and would endure still. Elrond's invitation to the once skeptical lords was not a summons from a subordinate, but a confident call from an equal, asking them to witness what their doubt had claimed was impossible. The lords who made the journey their faces guarded and prideful, did not find the vulnerable camp they had dismissed. They rode into a valley scarred, but standing, its air humming with a profound and weary power. They saw the new Grove of Remembrance, where every leaf seemed to hold a whispered name. They walked past elven smiths, who were no longer just forging swords, but mending tools and shaping harps, their hands steady despite the grief in their eyes. This was not a desperate outpost. It was a resilient community, its purpose validated not by words, but by sacrifice. The philosophical tension was palpable. The visiting lords had to reconcile their comfortable, ancient wisdom with this raw, proven truth. They had argued that boldness was folly, that a hidden refuge would only draw the enemy's eye. Yet here was Elrond's folly, standing strong, having absorbed the worst of that attention and emerged unbroken. Their political calculations, once so certain, now seemed dangerously short-sighted. In the newly completed Great Hall, beneath arches that still smelled of fresh timber and memory, Elrond met them. He did not speak of their past refusal. He did not list his losses to shame them. Instead, he stood, the weight of his recent wound still visible in his careful movements, and he offered them not a rebuke, but a place. He formally invited them to join his council, to lend their wisdom to the future of Imladris, not as petitioners, but as partners. It was a gesture of breathtaking political wisdom, transforming their potential humiliation into a shared responsibility. By offering them a seat, he was not begging for their support. He was demanding their respect and formally establishing his hidden valley as a new, equal seat of elven power in Middle-earth. The stakes of this reconciliation reshaped the entire political landscape of the Resistance. With the formal recognition and backing of Lindon and the other realms, Rivendell was instantly elevated. It was no longer just Elrond's personal refuge, a desperate gamble in the mountains. It became a cornerstone, a sanctioned bastion in the long war against the Shadow, its authority and influence now radiating far beyond its own borders. As the visiting lords gave their solemn pledges, the character of the work within the valley began to transform. The relentless urgency of fortification softened into the deliberate pace of creation. With their place in the world secured, the people of Imladris could finally turn their full attention inward, to the original dream of building not just a fortress, but a true home. The new silence in the valley felt like a held breath. The scars of battle remained, a stark map of violence etched into the earth where the grass refused to grow, and the memory of fear clung to the stones. Elrond stood before the gathered community, his own wound a dull echo of the land's pain, and he did not speak of rebuilding. He spoke of remembering and of healing. He called for a Song of Renewal, an ancient magic that would require not just his own power, but the voice and spirit of every elf in Imladris. This was not a task for lords and warriors alone. It was a task for healers, for cooks, for the youngest child who could hum a pure note. It was a weaving of their collective hope into the very soil. The ceremony began at dawn, a single, clear voice rising from Elrond's lips, a thread of pure light in the cool air. One by one, the others joined him. Their voices did not simply sing in harmony, they blended, creating a tapestry of sound that seemed to shimmer in the air, a visible resonance that settled over the broken ground. For 3 days and nights, the song continued, its melody shifting from lament to strength, from memory to promise. The strain was immense. You could see it in the faces of the singers, the way their bodies grew thin with the effort of channeling so much hope so soon after despair. It was a test of their spirit, a choice to pour their exhausted energy into creation rather than succumbing to grief. And then the land began to answer. Where blood had blackened the soil, clusters of Elanir flowers pushed through, their golden petals unfolding like tiny suns. The pale bark of the trees in the white grove began to glow with a soft, internal light, the gray scars fading as if washed away by the music itself. The air grew thick with the scent of blooming things and deep, abiding peace, a calm that felt more solid and enduring than the fragile quiet that had come before. At the heart of the song, Elrond made his most profound choice. He did not let the names of the fallen be forgotten in the past. He wove each one into the melody, singing their stories into the roots of the trees and the flow of the river. A warrior's courage became part of the strength in the valley's stone. A healer's compassion was woven into the resilience of the new growth. They were no longer lost. They had become the sanctuary, their sacrifice transformed into a permanent source of its protection and peace. The stakes of this ritual were the soul of Imladris itself. Success would forge this place into a true haven, a wellspring of light whose power was rooted in resilience and memory. Failure would have left it a beautiful, melancholy ruin, forever haunted by its losses. As the final collective note faded, not into silence, but into the natural sounds of the wind and water, the valley felt reborn. The foundations felt secure, not just in stone, but in spirit. Standing there in that renewed quiet, Elrond's gaze seemed to look beyond the mountains encircling his home. His purpose had been forged in defense and sealed in renewal, but now it expanded. This refuge was no longer just for his people. It was a promise, a sheltered harbor waiting in the mountains for any of the free peoples who would one day be caught in the growing shadows of the world. The renewed peace of the valley was given a new purpose. Elrond stood before his people in the great hall, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of a profound decision. He declared that the doors of Imladris would henceforth be open to all the free peoples of Middle-earth. This hidden refuge would now serve openly as a sanctuary for the weary, a library for imperiled knowledge, and a council place for any who stood against the shadow, be they elf, man, or dwarf. Messengers were dispatched along forgotten paths, carrying this simple, revolutionary promise into the wider world. The identity of Rivendell shifted in that single proclamation, transforming from a secret elven haven into a universal bastion of hope. Yet this grand vision was met with a ripple of unease among his own folk. Whispers drifted through the groves. Some feared that opening their doors so wide would dilute the very elven culture they sought to preserve. Would the rough ways of men, or the stubborn pride of dwarves, shatter the delicate peace they had fought so hard to secure? Could they trust strangers not to bring the eyes of the enemy with them? Elrond listened to these concerns with patience, but his resolve was absolute. He met the worried gazes of his council and spoke of a deeper truth. Our strength has never been in our isolation, but in our unity, he said. A single strand can be snapped, but a cord of many fibers can hold back the tide. He saw the coming war not as an elven struggle, but as a battle for the soul of all Middle-earth, and a sanctuary for only one kindred would be a fortress built on sand. His decision was immediately put into action. He commissioned the building of new guest quarters designed for different races, with larger doorways and lower hearths for dwarven delegates, and airy halls with open vistas for the tall men of the West. The Great Hall itself was expanded, its acoustics perfected to carry the many tongues of a united council. This was no longer just a refuge. It was being physically reshaped into a crossroads for the world. The stakes of this choice were immense. By positioning Imladris as the central hub for the resistance, Elrond was deliberately raising its profile. He was painting a target on his hidden valley, ensuring that Sauron would now see it not just as an elven nuisance, but as the greatest threat to his dominion, the place where his enemies could unite and plan. The safety of his people was being gambled for the hope of all peoples. The first to answer the call were not a host of glorious warriors or proud kings. They arrived as shadows at the edge of twilight, a small company of rugged men, their gray cloaks dusty and their faces etched with the fatigue of long vigilance. They were the Dúnedain, the last faithful remnants of Numenor, and they sought the wisdom of Elrond half-elven. Their quiet arrival marked the true beginning of Rivendell's enduring legacy, not as a closed citadel, but as a home for all who fought the long defeat. Their boots were worn to the leather, and their gray cloaks were stained with the mud of forgotten roads. The Dúnedain arrived not with fanfare, but with the quiet dignity of those who have carried a heavy burden for too long. They were led by a chieftain whose eyes held the grim light of a star seen through winter branches, a man named Elendil, whose lineage stretched back to the very kings of drowned Numenor. The elven sentries, accustomed to the grace of their own kind, watched these tall, weary men with a mixture of curiosity and ancient caution. Here was a people whose glory had faded, whose kingdoms had turned to dust and memory. Could their old pride and sorrow be trusted within these newly healed groves? Elrond did not meet them from a high seat. He walked out into the courtyard as the evening mist began to gather, and he welcomed them as if he had been expecting their shadows at his door all along. He saw past their travel-worn gear and into the unbroken line of their heritage, a spark of the West that had not been extinguished. They were given food and rest, their wounds tended with the same care shown to any elf. But the true work began when the chieftain Elendil asked for a private word. In the quiet of Elrond's study, with the scent of old books and fresh pine filling the air, the chieftain laid bare their desperate situation. He spoke of their constant vigilance against the creatures of the shadow, of their dwindling numbers, and of the precious heirlooms they guarded, artifacts of a lost kingdom that were now a dangerous burden. He did not ask for soldiers or for a new home. He asked for wisdom. In that moment, Elrond's choice was made. He looked upon this man, the heir of Isildur, and he saw not the failures of his ancestors, but the enduring hope of his people. He would become their advisor, their protector. He offered the rangers the full sanctuary of Imladris, a place where their children could be safe, their lore could be preserved, and their chieftains could always seek counsel. This was more than a political alliance. It was a binding of fates. Elrond was personally committing his refuge, this elven haven of song and memory, to the gritty, unending struggle of these wandering men. It was a decision that bridged a chasm of mistrust, forged by centuries of decline, a deliberate act of faith that wove the Dúnedain into the very fabric of the valley's purpose. With this alliance, the stakes for Rivendell were irrevocably heightened. It was no longer just a sanctuary for elves seeking to preserve the past. It had become a steward for the future of men, a guardian of their royal lineage and their fragile hopes. This meant taking on the sorrows and the dangers of their long road, tying the fate of the Hidden Valley to the rise and fall of human kingdoms for generations to come. When the Rangers departed days later, their resolve was strengthened, their purpose clarified by the wisdom they had received. Elrond stood on his porch and watched their gray forms disappear into the tree line. He felt the threads of many destinies, once scattered across the wild, now drawing tight around his home. The feeling was not one of dread, but of a profound and unshakable resolve. His refuge had found its greater calling, and he would stand as its keeper until the world changed.